C#, data access using a text file is really simple. In fact, to read from a text file, it takes one line. And again, to write to a text file takes just one more line. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do these one-liners and then how you can use a text file to really save and use data in C#. We're going to start with this text file here, test.txt. Inside here, I have 2 lines of text. And if you notice, it's comma delimited. We're going to skip over why it's comma delimited for now. We'll come back and actually break that apart later and use it. But for now, we're just going to read this as 2 different lines of text. So how do we do that? Well, let's start with a console application. I'll call this console UI. And my solution name I will call text file data access demo. Now the first thing I do in a console application is I come over here and at the end I say console read line. And what that does, it just stops the console from closing out before I've read what's on the screen. Now the reason I chose a console application is because it's very, very simple to get started. There's not a lot of overhead or extra stuff that needs to happen. So let's start by looking at how we can read from that text file. Now, if we go back to where that text file is, note that it's in C demos. So the full path is C demos test.txt. Let's go ahead and create a variable to hold that. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky if you're not used to dealing with strings. If I were to type C:/demos/test.txt, note that I get the red squigglies under each of the slashes. And the reason why is because the slash is a special character. It's an escape character. If I wanted to actually have a slash there, I could do a double slash. And that works, but it looks kind of ugly. The other option is in front of this string, you can put the @ symbol, and that just says this string is a string literal. There's no escape characters in there. So it's up to you which way you do it. But if you see this symbol somewhere in someone else's code, just know it means it's a string literal. All right, so there's our file path. So now how do you read from a file? Well, you need to have a using statement for system.io. And then we can say file dot read all lines. And you get a path. And that's it. So file dot read all lines and giving the file path will return an array of strings. Now we could say string array lines equals file.readAllLines. The thing is that a string array is kind of difficult to work with. So I usually prefer to use a list of string. Now that's not the return type of read all lines, but at the end of this, if we hit dot to list and call that helper method, it will convert this array of string to a list. And the reason I like to do this is because I like to add to my list potentially. And adding to a string array is just a little bit more difficult. So let's make sure this works. So I'm going to do a for each. And I'll say string line in lines. And this will just loop over every line in my list of string. And let's just do a console write line and write out that line. So all I'm doing here is reading all the lines from the text file, this right here. I'm converting it to a list, putting it in this variable. Then I'm looping through that variable one line at a time using the for each. And for each line, I'm writing that to the console. If I run this, I get those 2 lines, line 1, line 2. Now, what if we wanted to write back to that text file? Well, that's fairly simple. The code for that is file.writeAllLines. We give it the file path. Let's give it the same file path. And then we give it either a string array of contents, or we can do an IEnumerable of string. Well, a list of string is an IEnumerable. So we can pass directly in our lines variable, and that will write those lines. Now it's going to write to the same location. So how do we know that things have actually happened? Well, above here, we can say lines.add. And let's add a new item. Now I comma delimit it with 3 values. Let's do Sue, storm, www.stormy.com. Okay, so I have 3 values that are comma delimited in my text file. Those 3 values are first name, last name, and some type of URL. That's what I already have. I'm going to add one more line, so I'll add a first name, last name, some type of value. So I've added this to my list of string, so it should be at the end, and I should now have 3 lines written to my text file. Let's run this. It completed. We don't have any output to show us that we wrote, but if we close this out, we open up our file again, we now see we have 3 lines, Tim Corey, Joe Smith, and now Sue Storm in that new URL. So it works. So reading from a text file, this line right here, writing to a text file, this line right there. Now, how can we make use of this in a more comprehensive or more real-world type scenario? Well, let's go ahead and comment this out. We're going to start over again, but this time I'm going to create in my console a new class. Let's call this person. All right, so I've created 3 properties inside the person class. The first name, the last name, and a URL. Now, if you think back to my text file, let's open that up again. I have what looks like a first name, a last name, and a URL. So I'm kind of basing off what I already have. Let's first think of how we could access the data from that text file to populate a list of type person. So a list of person is our goal. We'll call it people. So how do we populate this list of person? Well, I would start with saying list of string lines equals file.read all lines. Oops, we commented out file path up here. And I'll convert that to a list. It's the same line as right here. I just retyped it. But now, in my for each, I'll still do line in lines. And you can keep this var if you want, or you can convert to a string. It's going to change itself to a string at runtime anyway. It's up to you. But now in here, I'm going to say string array entries equals line.split. And I'm going to split on the comma separator. What that's going to do is going to split this line into multiple entries based upon the comma delimitation. If we look back at our text file, when we read this line right here in, it's going to go into the first entry in this lines list. Next, when we do the for each, the first entry, this line right here, we put into the line variable. Then we'll take that line variable and split it on the comma. So this right here and this right here. And that resulting array will be put in this string array here called entries. So entries will have an entry for Tim. It'll have an entry for Corey. It'll have an entry for the www.imtimcorey.com. And we'll do that for every single line. Once we've done this, then we can say person, new person equals new person. New person dot first name equals entries 0. How do we know it's 0? Well, we opened that text file up and found it's the first item in the comma delimited list. New person dot last name equals entries 1, and new person dot URL equals entries 2. And then finally, people dot add new person. So what we're doing here is for every line, we're going to split it apart on the comma, and then we're going to create a new person entry. We're going to populate it with first name, last name, and URL from the entries array, from the values found there at the 0, 1, 2 positions. And we'll add that to our list of people. Just to show that this will work, let's do a for each. Let's do a console write line. And this time I'm going to do the $ format. This is a new format to C# 6.0. If you haven't seen it before, what you can do is put a $ in front of your double quotes. And then inside of your string, you can add these entries where you have the curly brace. And inside the curly brace, you can put actual C# code. So in this case, I'm going to put person first name. After the curly brace, I'll put a space. And then person dot last name. Close curly brace. And maybe I'll put a colon space and then that URL. So what's going to happen here is, because we use this $ here, these curly braces kind of escape out of the string and allow us to put C# code, which will get then put in this place. So it's going to take this out and put the value for first name in its spot. And notice a space here because we're still inside these double quotes, which that's going to be treated like a normal space inside double quotes. And then we'll have the last name, we'll have a colon space, and then the URL. So these get replaced right here with actual values. This would be the equivalent, if we want to look at it this way, of saying person dot first name plus double quote space double quote plus person dot last name plus double quote colon space double quote plus person dot URL inside of this right here. Okay, so that these two are equivalent as far as outcome. They are not equivalent as far as speed. This right here, much slower, much slower. This is a great new syntax. Let's run this just to see what happens. So the idea here is we read from that file, we put that into a list of string, and then for each line in there, we're going to split it apart and create a new person entry based upon the split apart entries. Once we've created that list of people, we're now going to iterate over it just to show that we do have an actual list of people. Let's run this, and now we have that list of people. Tim space Corey colon space www.iamtimcorey.com. So now we have read from a CSV file or a text file that's comma separated, and we've put that into an actual list of strongly typed object, in this case, type person. Now, the one thing I want to point out right up front is the idea that right now I have no error checking on this list. I'm assuming, which is always a bad thing when you're talking about programming, but I'm assuming that it has 3 entries per line. If it didn't, this could cause a problem and actually crash the application. So I would definitely recommend that if you do this method, that you check to make sure you have the proper number of entries per line. Now, if you didn't, that probably means you have invalid data. So in which case you wouldn't want to create a person. Maybe you wouldn't even want the application to continue. Maybe you want to stop and say, wait, let's readdress this first. But this might be as simple as surround this with a try catch, or by checking to make sure that entry count is always 3. So entries dot length, I believe. Entries dot length, that will give you the length of the array. And so if length is 3, then you're good. Otherwise, you've got a problem and you need to throw an error of some type. If you want to be lazy about it and not give a great error message, you could leave it without any type of error handling like it is here, and it will crash, but it will crash with an index out of range error. So that wouldn't be good. It also wouldn't catch any error where you had extra information on a line. Maybe the person put middle name, so first name, middle name, last name. Well, that'd be a problem because middle name would be treated like last name, and last name would go in the URL spot, and that's not what we want. So if you made sure that the entries list only had 3 items, so it had no less than and no more than 3 items. Otherwise, you throw an error because it's unexpected. So just some things to think about. Always make sure you have good error checking on your application. Don't just assume things will work. Assuming is the mother of all problems when it comes to programming. So, off my soapbox there. Right now we have a working application that is converting our existing text file to a list of strongly typed person objects. But what if we wanted to go the opposite direction? What if we said, okay, we have our people, and let's just do a console write line here. Read from text file, so we know that that's where we're at. And now what we're going to do is add a new person to our list. So people.add new person. We'll add Greg Jones. And Greg's URL is www.test.com. All right, if you're not familiar with syntax, what I'm doing here is I've got a list of people, each of type person. And I'm saying list.add, and it expects a person object, but I don't have a person object yet. No worries. I'm going to write in line, create a new person. And this creates a new instance. It's called an anonymous instance because it doesn't actually get assigned to a variable name. Instead, once we do this right here, it replaces this whole line with that new instance, which then gets added to our people array, or people list. So I say new person, then I use my curly braces, which allows me to set the value of properties. So property 1, property number 2, and property number 3 right at creation. So I'm going to set my first name, my last name, and my URL. And it's just a really neat little shortcut that allows us to create a class pretty quickly. So I've now added a person to my people array. How would I then take this value, or this whole list of values, and save it back to that same text file? Well, we can do basically the same process, but in reverse. So let's create a list of string. We'll call it output. And what we're going to do is we're going to do another for each. We're going to loop over that same list of people because that's the list that's now been updated, adding this new person, Greg. We're going to loop over that whole list, and for each person, we're going to add an entry to the output list. Remember that up here, file.writeAllLines, we can pass in a list of string. So we're going to create that list of string here. So output.add, and here's where we create our string. So I'm going to do a $sign and then 2 double quotes. I'll put my semicolon at the end just so I have it. Now all we need to do is create the string. Person.firstname. I'm doing my curly braces in order to have that be substituted. And then outside the curly brace, I'll put a comma, and then open the next curly brace and say person.lastname, close curly brace, comma, oops, no space, person.url, and no comma needed at the end. So we have first name, comma, last name, comma, URL for each one of these people. Now I have a list of string output, which means that I can say writing to text file. And then right down here, I'm going to do the same code as right here. So file.writeAllLines. I'm going to pass in the path, file path, which again is that variable. It's right up here. So use the same file name. And then I'm going to say, instead of a string array, I'm going to pass in my output, which is an IEnumerable. More specifically, it's a list of string. So there we go. And now I'll just put a console write line at the end, just to say all entries written. Okay, if we run this, read from the text file, there's the 1, 2, 3 entries. Now it says writing to text file, and now all entries have been written. It's very quick. We go over here to our text file. We now see Tim, Corey, Joe Smith, Sue Storm, and Greg Jones. And in fact, if we run this again, we're actually going to add another entry for Greg Jones, because now we read Greg Jones in, and then we write to him again. So we've already read in the 4 lines, and now we write the 5th. So that is reading from and writing to a text file, and here's how you can actually make use of it to store data and then repopulate it next time the application loads or whenever you need to access information. So really, if you want to, you could use text files as a cheap data storage solution without having to look at things like databases and installing things, making sure things are working, and all the rest of the complexities that come along with a full-fledged database. If you have any questions about this, leave a comment below, ask the question, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you have any suggestions for other videos you'd like to see, definitely leave those in the comments down below as well. Also, if you want to have a heads up on new things that are coming out from me, make sure to jump on my mailing list. My mailing list URL is in the description of this video. And as always, I really appreciate you watching, and I would really appreciate it if you'd subscribe as well. Thanks.